Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Corinth Center for Baha'i History. The center was established by the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States in January of 2024. Its purpose is to foster the study of Baha'i history, Baha'i sacred texts, Baha'i philosophical and theological concepts, and world religions from a Baha'i and comparative perspective. I'm Dr. Robert Stockman, the director of the center, and joining me today is Marco Oliveira, a Portuguese Baha'i who lives in Lisbon, Portugal. He was born into a Catholic family and accepted the Bahá'í Faith in 1984. He's married and has 2 children and works as a software engineer. He attended the Religious Sciences course at the Catholic University of Lisbon and is the author of the blog Povo de Baha, People of Baha. The deep study of Baha'i themes and the study of scripture and theology have been his passions. In recent years, he's devoted special attention to the study of Christian themes from a Baha'i perspective. And today he is going to give us a perspective, both Baha'i and historical, on the great Greek philosopher Socrates. This is actually the first of 3 presentations, which we hope will eventually materialize. The other 2, of course, being on Plato and Aristotle. Shall we call them the great Greek philosophical trinity? Perhaps that's not the right word to use. At any rate, I will now turn it over to Marco. Marco, welcome so much. I'm so glad you're joining us here at the Corinth Center for Baha'i Studies, for Baha'i History, and we're looking forward to hearing your presentation. I'll get your presentation going here and add it to the stage, and I'll turn off my microphone and camera for you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I hope you can see my screen. Thank you to the Corinth Center for Baha'i History for having me here today. And thank you all the friends who are present here. The purpose of this presentation, as you know, is to give a Baha'i perspective on Socrates. And when we hear about Socrates, we tend to remember the influence of ancient Greek philosophers in our culture, and also the influence of Greek culture in our world. We can easily find signs of that Greek influence. For instance, we know that about 5% of English words derive from Greek. And we immediately remember the word democracy that derives from Greek, from demos and kratos, meaning the power of the people. But there are other words like cosmopolitan, meaning citizen of the world, or marathon, an allusion to the Greek messenger who ran from the site of the Battle of Marathon up to Athens to inform the Athenians that they won the battle against the Persians. The word history also derives from Greek, meaning inquiry, narrative, account. The word barbarian was used to refer to those who didn't speak the Greek language. And of course, there are other words like academia, Europe, music, and so on. But besides words, we also have common expressions that have Greek roots. For instance, when we say someone has an Achilles heel, we are making an allusion to a Greek narrative, referring to the warrior Achilles, who had a weak point in his heel. So when we say someone has an Achilles heel, we're saying someone has a weak point. When we say that taking some action would be like opening a Pandora box, it's an allusion to a Greek myth. When we say that we had a job that was an Herculean task, it's also an allusion to a Greek myth, meaning we had a job that required a tremendous effort. And so we see these Greek roots in our language, in our culture, in many ways. And it's interesting that we get into the Baha'i writings and we find several references to ancient Greek philosophers. And these are always references in terms of praise. This is an example of one of those references where Abdu'l-Baha mentions the big 3, as Robert just mentioned. This is from a talk of Abdu'l-Baha in the United States in 1912. And he says the following.
The philosophers of Greece, such as Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, and others, were devoted to the invention. In their schools of teaching, they discoursed upon the world of nature as well as the supernatural world. Today, the philosophy and logic of Aristotle are known throughout the world because they were interested in both natural and divine philosophy, furthering the development of the physical world of mankind, as well as the intellectual. They rendered
So the focus of this presentation is on Socrates. Socrates, to whom Baha'u'lláh refers as the most distinguished of all philosophers. Socrates is mentioned 12 times in the Baha'i writings, in those writings that are currently translated to English. And I should add a disclaimer here at the beginning of this presentation. This is not a philosophical essay or an in-depth study of Socrates or his teachings. It's just a look from a Baha'i perspective to Socrates, to his main ideas, to those ideas that I, as a Baha'i, consider relevant, and to show how close they are to the Baha'i teachings. I guess this presentation may seem too simple for those of you who are familiar with the world of philosophy, and a little complex for those who are unfamiliar with that world. Well, I'll try to find a balance. Above all, my aim here is to show how many teachings of this most distinguished of all philosophers that we know are at the origin of the values of Western culture are validated by the Bahá'í Faith. And I hope that at the end of this presentation, you will realize that Socrates is worth knowing and worth studying. So these are the topics I will go through during this presentation. So who was Socrates? Well, Socrates is acknowledged as one of the most influential figures in the history of Western thought. He wrote no text, but he is considered one of the few philosophers who radically changed the way we view and conceive philosophy. Before him, other philosophers would focus their attention on the gods and on nature. But Socrates changed the focus. He changed the focus to knowledge, to virtue, to the good of man. So with Socrates, we see the emergence of ethics. His influence was felt far beyond philosophy and over several centuries. Well, we are here 24 centuries after his death, we are talking about him. And his character had some fascinating and even enigmatic aspects. Sometimes he's admired as if he were some religious figure. Some years ago, I was preparing another presentation on the Tablet of Wisdom, a tablet where Baha'u'lláh mentions several ancient Greek philosophers. And there is a long paragraph dedicated to Socrates. These are words from that paragraph.
What a penetrating vision into philosophy this eminent man had. He is the most distinguished of all philosophers and was highly versed in wisdom. We testify that he is one of the heroes in this field and an outstanding champion dedicated unto it. He had a profound knowledge of such sciences as were current amongst men, as well as of those which were veiled from their minds. Methinks he drank one draught when the most great ocean overflowed with gleaming and life-giving waters.
The photo you see there is a statue of Socrates in front of the Academy of Athens today. So, what do sources and history tell us about Socrates? Well, we know he wrote no text, he developed no theories, he didn't establish any school, but he is recognized, as I said, as one of the most influential figures in the history of Western thought. Everything we know is through other people. Text by his followers that contain the so-called Socratic dialogues, texts that are dedicated to him, and also comedies that satirized him. We know that Socrates had several followers. We know the names of 12 of his followers. We know that almost all of them wrote Socratic dialogues, and they would compete with each other. in writing those dialogues. Sometimes they would even plagiarize each other. But we have to be careful with these texts that are self-called Socratic dialogues, because we know that even 100 years after Socrates' death, there were still people claiming to be disciples of Socrates and writing Socratic dialogues. Of the text of Socrates' followers, only the dialogues of Xenophon and Plato were preserved. From the others, we have some dispersed quotations. And Plato and Xenophon, these two followers who wrote the dialogues that were preserved, they knew Socrates personally. Therefore, their dialogues are considered reliable. However, Plato and Xenophon present different perspectives on Socrates. Sometimes it seems that there are two distinct Socrates. Plato, for instance, presents a Socrates that recognizes his ignorance, who doesn't know how to define virtues, who denies being a master, a Socrates who is not interested in politics or economy, a Socrates that criticizes Pericles, who rejects honor and fame, a Socrates that in his dialogues would use irony, rebuttal frequently, and his dialogues would often lead to aporia, that is, a state of puzzlement. And according to Plato, Socrates claimed to be guided by a divine spirit, a daimonion, a divine spirit that would always give him a negative advice. That is, it would always tell him what not to do. Now, according to Xenophon, Socrates never recognizes his ignorance. Socrates knows how to define virtues. Socrates presents himself as a master and is interested in politics and economy. According to Xenophon, Socrates praises Pericles, accepts honor and fame, and in his dialogues he doesn't use irony, rarely uses rebuttal, and his dialogues seldom lead to aporia, that state of puzzlement. And according to Xenophon, the divine spirit that guides Socrates always gives him positive advice. That is, it always tells him what to do. Socrates was born during the 5th century before the Common Era. This is called the Greek century. It was a moment of prosperity and growth for many Greek cities. It was a century that started with the Greek-Persian Wars, where the Persian Empire faced a coalition of Greek cities, wars that are described by some historians as the First World War of Classic Age. Those wars ended with a victory of the Greek cities, and then it followed a moment of prosperity that allowed Athens to build the Parthenon, that temple dedicated to the goddess Athena, whose ruins we can still see today in Athens. It was during that 5th century before the Common Era that Pericles was elected strategos of the city of Athens several times. And the century, that is also called the Greek century or Pericles century, the century ended with the Peloponnesian War, a war between two coalitions of Greek cities. From one side, Sparta, the militaristic and authoritarian city of Sparta, and from the other side, the democratic and free Athens. This war ended with the defeat of Athens, and that caused a tremendous political, social, and religious crisis in Athens, and that had consequences on Socrates, as we'll see later. So, Socrates. We know that Socrates was born around the year 469, before the Common Era. We know he was the son of a stonesman or sculptor and a midwife. They lived in a suburb of Athens. It was a family of low social level. Like most Athenian children during that century, Socrates had an elementary education, that is, he learned to read and to write, but his family had the means to provide him other studies, and those studies include gymnastics and music. Probably Socrates learned his father's trade, but he decided to dedicate himself into philosophy. So historians assume that he must have inherited the means that allow him to take this option. But gradually he had financial difficulties and went broke. He married Xantippe, a younger woman from a higher social strata, a woman who supported him. They had 3 children, but it wasn't a happy marriage. It seems that Xantippe had bad temper and they had many discussions. After turning 18, Socrates served in the military service for 2 years. That was the duty of every Athenian citizen. And during his life, he participated in 3 military campaigns: the siege of Potidæa, the defeat of the Athenians at Delium, and the Battle of Amphipolis. Notice that during the siege of Potidæa, Socrates was already 37 years old. And at the Battle of Amphipolis, he was 47. You see, almost 50 years old, and he was taking part in battles. Probably, according to historians, it was only during these military campaigns that Socrates was absent from Athens. And that was something unusual for thinkers and philosophers at that time. The dialogues describe Socrates as a good soldier. In combat, he would show enormous courage, enormous self-control, and he did not give in to fear. He was able to walk barefoot on snow, covered only with a cape. He would endure hunger, thirst, cold, and fatigue. Who was this real Socrates? Well, the works of Plato help us to understand who was the real Socrates. We know he was a well-known figure in Athens, an ugly man indifferent to material pleasures, who would spend his days walking around the agora, that is the central plaza in the city and in a Greek city. And he would be walking all his day and questioning people, dialoguing with people. And his dialogues, he developed a type of reasoning that highlighted the contradictions of his interlocutors. He said that with those dialogues, he intended to awaken conscience and to educate souls. His teachings attracted some Athenians, especially young people, but he was also a target of satirical plays. There was a satirical play called The Clouds that represented Socrates suspended by a rope in the air, saying that he wanted to better observe the sun and the stars and be away from the earth and the thoughts of men. This image of the Socrates of comedy probably corresponded to the image that the common citizen of Athens had of him. There were probably some jokes about him. They must have crossed on his path. They must have heard about him. Concerning the city politics, Socrates wouldn't take sides. He would criticize both democrats, tyrants, and oligarchs. In the 5th century, Athens became a center of great cultural activity. There would be visitors from all over the Mediterranean world. There was a greater contact with new ideas, with new cultures, and there was a greater circulation of books. And Socrates was a good reader, but he was a critical reader. The texts of Plato and Xenophon show that he knew the literature and the thought of time. He would contact with philosophers of his time. He would speak to foreigners and people from all social strata. Concerning this contact with books that would circulate through the Mediterranean during that century, a Jewish Hellenistic philosopher, Aristobulus of Panaeus, who lived in the 2nd century before the Common Era, he wrote that parts of the Pentateuch were translated to Greek, and they were sent to the Greek cities. And Pythagoras, Socrates, and Plato used those partial translations as a basis for their philosophical teachings. So we have here some sources saying that, yes, these Greek philosophers had contact with the Jewish religion. So Socrates would spend his days wandering around Athens, followed by his young followers, and question different people. Typically, Socrates would start a dialogue, asking a knowledgeable person on a subject for a definition on that subject. For instance, If the person was known to be a just person, he would ask for a definition of justice. If the person was known to be a courageous person, okay, ask for a definition of courage. And once Socrates got that first definition, he would start questioning that person until the person would contradict his first definition. And then Socrates would say, well, maybe we need a better definition. Can you provide another definition? And the person would give a better definition. And again, Socrates would start asking questions until he would find another contradiction. And then he would ask, okay, we need an even better definition. Can you provide an even better definition? And he would go on like this. For the followers who were witnessing these dialogues, it was they could notice that that knowledgeable person was not that knowledgeable as it was supposed to be, and that his opinions on the subject were questionable. One can also understand that those Athenians were being questioned by Socrates once they felt that they would enter into contradiction in front of Socrates and all his young followers, that we can admit that some of them would laugh. Those Athenians will feel very uncomfortable. But we can also admit that other Athenians would appreciate those dialogues and would be feel thankful to Socrates for helping them coming closer to better definitions on those topics they were supposed to be experts. From a Baha'i perspective, we can say that Socrates was in search of truth. With his dialogues, Socrates was helping the interlocutor to free himself from preconceived and inconsistent concepts and to seek universal truth, better definitions. Socrates wanted people to recognize their own ignorance so that they could perceive a greater truth. He said he was helping people to be born again. Socrates sometimes said that with his dialogues, he was practicing the same art as his mother, who was a midwife. Only that his mother was helping with the birth of the body of the children, and he was helping the birth of the souls, of the ideas. It is also interesting that in several Baha'i writings, we can find something similar to this Socratic method. We can find questions that lead the reader to discover the correct answer for himself. We know that in these writings, Baha'u'lláh guides us to the truth. But he also warned us that before searching for the truth, we must detach ourselves from everything that is on earth and in the heavens. Just like Socrates wanted people to free themselves from preconceived and inconsistent concepts. So we have here an interesting parallel. And finding that greater truth was, in fact, like a spiritual rebirth, a birth of the soul. What did Socrates say about his method of teaching with questions? Well, we have his words here.
Really, Ishamakus, I'm disposed to ask, does teaching consist in putting questions? Indeed, the secret of your system has just this instant dawned upon me. I seem to see the principle in which you put your questions. You lead me through the field of my own knowledge, and then, by pointing out analogies to what I know, persuade me that I really know some things which hitherto, as I believed, I had no knowledge of.
So, asking questions is a sign of an healthy intellectual life. And the need to ask questions is raised in many cultures. I remember, for instance, Confucius in China, who said, a man who asks a question is a fool for a minute. A man who never asks questions is a fool for life. And we can easily point several occasions on the Baha'i writings where we are faced with questions, where Baha'u'lláh or Abdu'l-Baha asks us questions that help us to find the truth for ourselves. This is a quotation from the Book of Certitude, the Kitab-i-Kan, where Baha'u'lláh asks questions to the uncle of the Bab and to the reader of that book.
And now we ask, is it fair for this people to view with doubt and misgiving this most weighty testimony, the divine origin of which God hath proclaimed and pronounced to be the embodiment of truth? Is it fair for them to turn away from the thing which he hath appointed as the supreme instrument of guidance for attainment unto the loftiest summits of knowledge, and to seek aught else but that book? How can they allow men's absurd and foolish sayings to sow the seeds of distrust in their minds? How can they any longer idly contend that a certain person hath spoken this or that way, or that a certain thing did not come to pass? Had there been anything conceivable besides the book of God which could prove a more potent instrument and a surer guide to mankind, would he have failed to reveal it in that verse?
Another book that in the Baha'i writings that also has a lot of questions to guide the reader is Some Unanswered Questions by Abdu'l-Baha. An interesting event in the life of Socrates occurred at the Oracle of Delphi. The Oracle of Delphi was a sanctuary dedicated to Apollo, and it was famous amongst the citizens of Greek cities in that time. Pilgrims and devotees would go to that sanctuary, and they would ask the Pythia, that is the high priestess, for some questions that were of their concern. For instance, should I allow my son or my daughter to get married with some person? Should I make business with someone from another city? And even politicians would go there and ask the Pythia if they should go, should they establish an alliance with another city? Should they go to war with another city? And inevitably, the Pythia would answer with some obscure sentences, some disjointed phrases, and the pilgrims, the devotees, they had to interpret those words. Now, when Socrates' fame as a philosopher was growing in Athens, one of his friends, Chaerephon, went to Delphi, and he asked a straight question to the Pythia: is there anyone wiser than Socrates? And surprisingly, the Pythia's answer was clear and unequivocal: there is no one wiser than Socrates. This event, this episode at the Oracle of Delphi, has touched many commentators to produce their opinions, and also artists. For instance, this is a painting by an Italian from the 19th century, Bianca Camillo Miola. You see there at the center, the Pythia is seated. She's in a state of trance, and she's surrounded by other priests. And here in front of her there are two devotees with olive branches and some offerings. You see, one of the devotees is looking at the Pythia and listening to what she is saying. During his trial, Socrates said that he was surprised with the statement from the Pythia, because he always maintained that he wasn't wise. However, he also believed that a god couldn't lie. And so he tried to find someone that could be wiser than him. And he started questioning other people even more frequently. People had a reputation for being wise. And then he realized that he was wiser than them, because unlike them, he wasn't claiming to know what he didn't know. Socrates recognized that as a human being, his knowledge was limited and insecure, and that made him different from other men, and that made him wiser in the eyes of the Pythia. Another interesting aspect of Socrates' life is that he claimed to be guided by a divine spirit, the so-called daimonion, a divine spirit that had always accompanied him since childhood. And it was like a voice that he would hear within himself. And his voice would speak to him in the most diverse situations. Now, historians describe daimonions as an intermediary between gods and men. And some other historians suggest that a daimonion would be a hidden manifestation of a god himself. Of course, when we hear these claims of being guided by a divine spirit, we immediately tend to ask, what was the role of this daimonion, of this divine spirit in Socrates' activity as a philosopher? Was it guiding him? Was it instigating him, facilitating his work? Philosophers and historians always try to answer that question. In the 5th century in Athens, in other Greek cities, it was common that people had preferences for some gods, for Apollo or others, and they would justify their actions based on some inspiration they would receive from those gods. However, and some people would even claim that, well, they also had, these daimonians, these voices they would hear, but they would keep those personal mystic experiences as only with the friends. It was a private talk. Socrates, on the contrary, he never worried to hide his relationship with the deity, and he mentioned this daimonion, his dialogues with the daimonion, in several of his dialogues. And at his trial, Socrates refers several times to this relation with the deity and the way it communicated with him. He says this, but this duty, as I say, has been enjoined me by the deity, by oracles, by dreams, and by every mode by which any other divine decree has ever enjoined anything to man to do. This would become problematic because for many Athenians, this opening talk about a personal God sound to many Athenians that Socrates was trying to replace the city gods with his personal God. So Socrates talked about a personal relationship with the divine spirit. And inevitably we have this question, was Socrates monotheistic? This relation, as I said, was subject of long debates. Who was that deity? Was he referring to Apollo or to the one true God in a monotheistic sense? Some authors claim that Socrates was a polytheistic, and it were the translations of his dialogues done by Christian scholars who interpret Plato's text and present Socrates as a monotheistic. But other present arguments to justify that the divinity referred to by Socrates can be identified with the one true God of the monotheistic religions. And they state that in many of his dialogues, for instance, in the Republic, Socrates, according to Plato, describes the narratives of the gods who conspire, who kill, who lie, who steal, who fight, describes those narratives as false, because the narratives of the gods, they have to convey, they have to transmit a moral sense to the humans. And narratives who describe the gods behaving like humans have no value, according to Socrates. And how do we Baha'is answer this question? Was Socrates monotheistic? Well, in the tablet to Dr. Auguste Forel, Abdu'l-Baha answers this question.
Socrates the Wise believed in the unity of God and the existence of the soul after death. As his opinion was contrary to that of the narrow-minded people of his time, that divine sage was poisoned by them.
So, yes, we Baha'is believe that Socrates was a monotheistic. And now to the subject of ethics. As I said before, Socrates' philosophers would focus their attention on nature and gods, but Socrates shifts that attention to virtues, to the good of man. Virtues as wisdom, courage, justice, friendship. In his dialogues, Socrates tried to make the interlocutor perceive the gaps and inconsistencies in his own ideas, to forget the smallness of his personal experience, and to perceive a higher wisdom. And perceiving that higher wisdom would lead inevitably to the improvement of the individual. And everyone could perceive, once it forgot the smallness of his personal experience, once it perceived the gaps and inconsistencies of his own ideas, everyone could perceive that higher wisdom and inevitably improve himself. It was like an awakening to a new reality. And for Socrates, knowledge and virtue are inseparable. Every advancing knowledge would inevitably lead to an improvement and in individual virtue. Socrates has this most quoted sentence: "The unexamined life is not worth living." For Socrates, once a person reflects on his or her actions, he or she is opening the door to a meaningful life. And for Socrates, when someone does something evil, it's because he didn't examine the matter sufficiently and didn't know how to act. So evil actions are a product of ignorance. Vices were also forms of ignorance, and virtues were forms of wisdom. And virtues would inevitably lead the individual to the true happiness. These words, the unexamined life is not worth living, they remind us, those words of Baha'u'lláh in the hidden words, where he says, "Bring thyself to account each day." You see, both Socrates and Baha'u'lláh exhorting us to examine ourselves. Baha'u'lláh says to examine ourselves every day. In many texts, many dialogues written by Plato and Xenophon, we'll find the exhortation of virtues. And this quote here, Socrates argue that once a person is a city of Athens, and Athens is so powerful and has this fame of a free and wise city, a citizen of Athens should also reflect the virtues of the city.
I shall never cease from the practice and teaching of philosophy, exhorting anyone whom I meet after my manner, and convincing him, saying, O my friend, why do you, who are a citizen of the great and mighty and wise city of Athens, care so much about laying up the greatest amount of money and honor and reputation, and so little about wisdom and truth, and the greatest improvement of the soul, which you never regard or heed at all? Are you not ashamed to care? I do not depart or let him go at once. I interrogate and examine and cross-examine him, and if I think that he has no virtue, but only says that he has, I reproach him with overvaluing the greater and undervaluing the less.
And of course, in the Baha'i writings, on several occasions, we find advices for us to develop virtues. That's the purpose of our life here, to develop virtues, to perfect ourselves. This is one example of Baha'u'lláh exhorting us to develop divine virtues.
The virtues and attributes pertaining unto God are all evident and manifest, and have been mentioned and described in all the heavenly books. Among them are trustworthiness, truthfulness, purity of heart while communing with God, forbearance, resignation to whatever the Almighty hath decreed, contentment with the things His will hath provided, patience, nay, thankfulness in the midst of tribulation, and complete reliance in all circumstances upon Him. These rank, according to the estimate of God, among the highest and most laudable of all acts. All other acts are, and will ever remain, secondary and subordinate unto them.
So we see that human virtues, the development of virtues, is encouraged and praised both by Socrates and by Baha'u'lláh. So we now come to the final moment, the final event on Socrates' life, his trial and conviction. Why would a city like Athens, a city that was a model of wisdom and freedom for all Greek cities, a city that had a vocation for debate and critical sense of its decisions, why would such city condemn its best citizen, its philosopher par excellence? Well, Socrates' relationship with Athens was complicated. There were followers and opponents mobilizing with enthusiasm. And his teachings and questions about nature and gods and human virtues began to be seen as subversive and as an attack to traditional religious practices and morals. Have in mind that in ancient Greece, like in ancient Rome, religion was more a matter of practices than beliefs. And Socrates would openly ask, what's the use of those sacrifices and prayers to the gods? What are they good for? Shouldn't we, man, provide the gods with services of different nature? And Socrates argued that the only service that man could provide to the gods would be developing their own virtue. And of course, Socrates' activity enabling others to develop their virtues was the most appreciated service by the gods. This wasn't well received by many citizens of Athens, because after the defeat in the war with Sparta, the Peloponnesian War, the political climate in Athens deteriorated. And after the defeat, the democratic government was replaced by a dictatorship, the so-called rule of the 30 tyrants. And some months later, they restored democracy, but it was a weaker system, and there was a great political instability. Several friends of Socrates were arrested, exiled, and even executed. And a religious crisis also arises. Many Athenian citizens were blaming the relaxation of religious practices as a reason for the animosity of the gods who withdrew their protection to the city of Athens, and consequently, they were defeated in a war with Sparta. So he was seen as an heretic. According to Plato's Apology, the accusations against Socrates appear to have some faith-related issues. They say that Socrates committed crimes, Socrates corrupted young people, so he was demotivating them from attending those religious practices. Socrates wasn't considering the city gods, and he even tried to change them for new deities. That personal god, that daimonion he claimed was guiding him. Also, in some dialogues, Socrates, he couldn't avoid criticizing the rulers, both being democrats, oligarchs, or tyrants. And in a time of political instability, some of that criticism was seen as a treason. So there were several reasons to condemn Socrates. And in 399, before the Common Era, he was condemned for heresy. And his execution is a much commented event by ancient thinkers and the modern philosophers. That event even touched the heart of some artists. For instance, this French painter, Jacques-Louis David, from the 18th century, he portrays Socrates here at the center. He's about to take a cup with poison for great despair of his followers. Could Socrates avoid a death sentence? Yes, he could. He could have said things that would allow him to avoid the death sentence, but he refused to do it. And he says this once he heard about the death sentence or the risk of being condemned to death.
I would rather die having spoken in my manner than speak in your manner and live. For neither in war nor yet in law ought any man use every way of escaping death. For often in battle there is no doubt that if a man will throw away his arms and fall on his knees before his pursuers, he may escape death if a man is willing to say or do anything. The difficulty, my friends, is not in avoiding death, but in avoiding unrighteousness, for that runs deeper than death.
And in the Tablet of Wisdom, in that long paragraph dedicated to Socrates, Bahá'u'lláh refers to the life and death of Socrates with these words:
After him came Socrates, who was indeed wise, accomplished, and righteous. He practiced self-denial, repressed his appetites for selfish desires, and turned away from material pleasures. He withdrew to the mountains where he dwelt in a cave. He dissuaded men from worshipping idols and taught them the way of God, the Lord of mercy, until the ignorant rose up against him. They arrested him and put him to death in prison. Thus relateth to thee this swift-moving pen.
So they arrested him and put him to death. This was, as I said, an event that touched the heart of many artists. And there you see a sculpture by a Russian sculptor, Mark Antonovsky, 19th century. There you see the dead Socrates. So, what can I say as a conclusion for this presentation? Both Baha'u'lláh and Abdu'l-Baha praise Socrates and validate many of his teachings. In his way of constantly questioning his fellow Athenian citizens, we see a principle of independent search for truth. His claim to be animated by a divine spirit, the daimonion, that claim leads us to the words of Baha'u'lláh, who says that he appears to have drunk one draught when the most great ocean overflow with gleaming and life-giving waters. His ethical teachings, the importance of self-reflection, self-examination, are undeniable close to Baha'i teachings. And the final outcome of his life shows an absolute determination in defending his principles and his teachings. And for all this, Socrates deserves our respect, our admiration. And friends, this is what I have to share with you here today. I'll be glad to share this document I'm using here as a presentation for you. I included here several references to documents who helped me organize the ideas and the topics of these presentations. Also several books that I read and also helped me understanding Socrates and the culture he grew in. And also several references to other resources on internet for further study on Socrates and Greek philosophy from a Baha'i perspective. There is this video by John Hatcher on the Tablet of Wisdom, really good video. Mikhail Sergeyev has several videos that present a Baha'i perspective from a Baha'i perspective on the Greek philosophy. I am sure that in the decades and centuries to come, we'll see within the Baha'i community a renewed interest in the Greek classical studies because of these so many references we find in our writings. And I consider these videos by Mikhail Sergeyev the beginning of that renewed interest. And these videos are really fantastic. So God knows what's about to come in that renewed interest. There are also references. There are articles that focus on the parallels between Socrates and the Bahá'í Faith. And we can easily find articles on topics that are common to the Bahá'í Faith and Socrates' teachings. And so this is it. Thank you very much for your presence here.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic, Marco. Really fascinating. I love the way you summarize things because you really pulled all of the basic information together, put it in a marvelous order, wove the Baha'i and historical materials together. Really, it was a very, very well done presentation. So I'm really grateful that you did it, and looking forward to these other two that you want to do at some point soon. We have various comments from Steve Collins here, and we may get some questions from other people as well. And I'm not quite sure what to make of some of these questions. Furio says, thank you so much, wonderful presentation, and it's very, very much true. Steve, one question he had was, it's not a matter purely of people around him, but in some sense, any set of people around would have done the same. And I'm not sure what that refers to because it's no longer in its context. You started out by talking about examples of Greek words that have come into English and phrases and such. And he wanted to know whether that was also true, I think, of other languages. And I'm sure it's true of Portuguese as well.
Yeah. Yes, Portuguese, Italian, French, Spanish, they all have Greek influence.
Yeah. And no doubt Russian, the word demokratia certainly has been borrowed into a zillion languages. I think even Persian uses it sometimes, I think. So there's certainly been a lot of influence that way. Could you have any thoughts about this whole question about the Greek philosophers actually meeting the prophets of ancient Israel?
Okay. Historians don't have, Western historians don't have references to the presence of Socrates in Syria or Palestine. But Islamic historians and Islamic philosophers claim that some of them claim that Socrates was in Syria, was in Palestine. Some even claim that Socrates was Syrian. Abdu'l-Bahá refers the presence. He mentions the presence of Socrates on Palestine. Okay, we don't have historical evidence of that. Okay. What we know as a Baha'i, okay, the spiritual intuition of Abdu'l-Bahá is above our perception. Okay, so we, as historians or readers of books written by historians, okay, we can understand something. Okay, but we cannot claim that what Abdu'l-Bahá tells us, that is fruit of his spiritual intuition, okay, that is an historical fact. Because if you're going to do that, we're going to reduce Abdu'l-Bahá to an historian. God forbid. We can say, yes, okay, I believe that Socrates was in Palestine because Abdu'l-Bahá said. And that's an act of faith. And that's different. It's not, notice that is not going, an act of faith doesn't go against reason. An act of faith is above reason, okay? And so, yes, as a Baha'i, I perfectly admit that Socrates was in Palestine. As a researcher, an investigator of these books written by historians, I see there is no evidence on that, okay? So I don't mix these two planes of knowledge, spiritual and academical, so to say.
Interesting. I wonder if one can take it more metaphorically in various ways also, because we know that there was extensive commerce between the Greek cities and the Levant, certainly with the Phoenicians, but there's Greek pottery throughout Israelite archaeological sites. So we know there was a lot of traffic back and forth. And you mentioned this whole question about the Pentateuch being translated into Greek. Where was that information from again?
Aristobulus of Panaeus. We only have some fragments of his writings, but one of these fragments states this, that first there are parts of Pentateuch that were translated, and these parts were sent to Greek cities, and only later the Pentateuch would be fully translated. I believe he refers that to the Septuaginta.
Right. Yeah. The Septuagint is 3rd or 4th century, I suppose. It's certainly after Alexander the Great.
Yes.
That's when Greek was spread throughout that whole area. But that's interesting that Aristobulus would mention that, because that does suggest that the ideas certainly had the ability.
Was circulating.
And that certainly seems quite likely, actually. Let's see what else we have here. Persian does use the word democracy, indeed. Steve I'm still not quite sure, Steve, he says, of the Fourth Valley. People around him linked to the previous question of Socrates being the kind of irritable to those around him. I wonder if his trial was a kind of personal Fourth Valley. I can't remember which valley the Fourth Valley is, but
neither do I. Sorry.
Yeah. So, but certainly, I think one of the amazing things about the trial is that, of course, we think a lot about the suffering of prophets and manifestations, and we have here the example of a philosopher who preferred to die than to betray his beliefs, and that, of course, is a position and that's quite remarkable and something that's highly respected, highly respectful by us. So,
yeah, it is. It's when I after reading so many things about Socrates, when I finished this presentation, I wondered myself. I thought myself, how close was Socrates to divine teachings? Okay, he wasn't a prophet, manifestation of God. We have no statement like that in our writings and in any other writings. But how close was he? When Baha'u'lláh says he drank one quaff from the most great ocean, wow, he was really close. He was really close.
And he had his daimon, his daimonion, his spirit or God, which is a kind of metaphor for receiving something from beyond, using the language and the ideas that existed in Greek at the time. There probably was no concept of revelation per se at that time. That wouldn't have been part of polytheism. But that's how they would have thought about it, is through a god whispering it or influencing you. So that is an interesting question. The other thing that occurs to me is that people often, when they hear the word philosopher or philosophy, they tend to think of it in terms of the 21st century, where our philosophers don't talk about God. They focus heavily on logic, and they focus on these kinds of highly abstract and you might call them secular topics, but that's not the kind of philosophy that existed back then. Even Confucius, as you noted, is a philosopher who is very concerned about heaven and your right relationship with heaven and such. So philosophy was far more theologically oriented and far more concerned with religious questions in those days than it is today. And we have to kind of reset our thinking a little bit when we hear that word philosopher.
Yeah, I think that with as I said, with the expected renewed interest in ancient classic Greek thinkers that the Bahá'í Faith will foster, I'm sure that will shift the attention of philosophy again to ethical and theological topics. It won't be like it was in Greek times. It won't be like it is today. It will be a step further. What I think it's absolutely fantastic about these Greek classic thinkers is that we look at the Bahá'í Faith in terms of a progressive revelation, when one revelation comes after another, and that enables the development of human society. But when we see that the Bahá'í Faith goes to the roots of Western values, goes to the ethical sources of Western civilization and takes it a step further. So we're not only talking of a progressive revelation, we're also talking about a progressive philosophy. Well, that's a fantastic new world being born.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a very good point. And it raises the interesting question of what Baha'i philosophers will be turning to and how they'll be rethinking aspects of philosophy, especially philosophical ethics.
No. No.
I took a little bit of a course on Christian ethics once, a long time ago. One of the things that struck me was how issues of love and justice, which were not particularly important, they existed but not particularly important in Greek philosophy, became central in Christian theology and philosophy, and the whole issue of the contrast between love, which of course relates to mercy, and justice, which usually does not relate to mercy but to punishment, and how to balance these things. And it occurs to me that the concept of the oneness of mankind and the concept of human unity has the ethical power to revise, to bring about a new foundation in ethics. And we have not yet explored those ethical implications sufficiently in the Baha'i community, but we will.
Yeah, we will.
And here's an interesting question Steve asks, and that's about Socrates and the axial age. Yes, this is the axial age, isn't it?
Yes. We'll, as I said, we have to take the best. When you look at Baha'i principles, okay, we can see them isolated from the rest of the world. Okay, we're going to renew it. No, we're going to the best we had in classic values. Okay, and we've revitalized those teachings and give them a theological basis. And I believe that much of the transformation we'll see in our societies will go through there.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Well, I think that mostly wraps things up for today. I don't see much else, other questions to ask. So again, I want to thank you, and I want to sort of say that that's it today from the Corintru Center for Baha'i History. I want to thank everyone for joining us, and we hope you'll join us again in 2 weeks when we will hear from, if I remember right, Mujan Momen talking about the development of Baha'i faith in Britain and the various phases and growth spurts that community went through. So I think that would be a very interesting historical topic for us to turn to, and I hope you will all join us again at that time.
Yes.
Meanwhile,
Yes.
thank you everyone again, and goodbye.